Very good afternoon to you. Let's get into the debate, the uncensored one. Let's tackle the issue of racism allegations that have been leveled against the Cornwall Hill College, which have yet again put the spotlight back onto the lack of transformation in private schooling institutions, from changing the culture in South African private schools where issues of racism have been raised, and an inadequate number of black teachers where black learners don't feel at home in these institutions. How do private schools address the issue of transformation? Are schools struggling to transform decades after democracy? That's the question. And let's speak now to Terry Oakley-Smith. She is CEO of an organization, Diversity. Asanda Ngwasheng, a diversity expert. Lebogang Munjane, he is the executive director of the Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa, and Dr. Sizwe Nxasana, founder of Future Nations Schools. To all of you, thank you very much for making the time to talk to us about this very important debate. Can I ask all of you to please make an opening statement? It is what we do on this show. Very briefly, less than a minute. I'll start with you, Terry Oakley-Smith, about what you think needs to be done to rid private schools of racism, or at least allegations of racism.
I think we've been talking about this issue for, well, I have since 1998. And I think that, very little has been done. I think it's partly because, of all the organizations one works in, schools are the most complex. I think that the kind of stakeholders, the people they have, not just looking at the numbers, but the culture as well. I think there's great complexity in schools. And very often we rush in with our solutions, but we don't take the time to step back and actually survey and learn what actually is the issue in this school. Because no two private schools are the same. They're all different. So I think that one of the most important things that I've learned over the years is how important it is to actually understand what's happening before you come in with interventions.
Yeah. Dr. Nxasana?
Well, let's just start and say, racism in whatever form is completely unacceptable. It doesn't matter that it happens in schools or in society or in business or at places of work. And, what we've seen, it's quite clear that, transformation has been very slow, that racism continues to happen in schools. And yet schools are very, very important because, that's where learning and, cognitive development of young children particularly takes place. And we need to be building an inclusive society, a society where people understand that we are a country that must continue to transform. And obviously, to the extent that this is not happening, is really something that needs to be exposed, it needs to be rejected, needs to be fought and dealt with.
Asanda Ngwasheng?
Thank you. I think that for me, the most critical thing is to always remind people that racism is a societal issue, first of all. Which means that we see racism in schools, we see racism in corporates, and we see racism in universities and all aspects of life. And so it shouldn't surprise us when schools, which are a microcosm of society, are displaying the very same, prejudices that we see everywhere else. And so for me, the solution needs to be tackled first at an institutional level, by government, who needs to step in and actually do the monitoring and evaluation role that they're supposed to play, because private schools don't just become private schools. They have licenses and government issues those licenses. And then secondly, regulatory bodies like ISASA also need to step up, because ISASA has a great diversity charter. ISASA has amazing diversity consultants. But what ISASA doesn't have is schools who are taking transformation seriously and doing what they're supposed to do. And I think that until we start talking about it as an institutional problem and dealing with it as an institutional problem, we're going to find ourselves in a very scary place where we are running from one crisis to another. And so, yes, it's important that we talk about this issue. It's important that we highlight this issue each time it happens. But racism happens every day to black people. And most South African schools that are former white schools, that are private and public, are not safe spaces for our children. And that is the main concern that I have. And that is why I particularly worked on a diversity and social justice curriculum, because I believe just as much as society teaches children racism, children can be taught how not to be racist, how to be more equitable, and how to deal with prejudice when it actually does confront them.
Lebogang Monjane, I'm not going to ask you to respond to Ayanda just yet. She is tackling you head on as ISASA, but your opening statement, sir.
I would say that I thank Asanda and I agree actually with her, so I'm not actually going to respond to her at all, in the sense that we are in consensus. But I must just clarify that ISASA is not a regulatory body. We are an association of schools that elect to be members of our association. The duty of care, and I think that for me, the duty of care for schools rests with provincial departments of education. And my deep concern is, if this is not an issue about racism, this is about an issue of constitutional duties of care for children. And if we are in a society in which we do not take that constitutional duty of care for children, it is a problem. And I think we need to shift the discussion away. And I think that we at ISASA have actually gone through a long journey. We started off in 2006 as it's a nice thing to do. About a year ago, about 2 years ago, we realized that actually there's Labor Relations Act requirements for compliance with in terms of transformation and diversity. And now we really have come to the question of duty of care.
Yeah.
If an adult, irrespective of who they are, violates the rights of a child, they are harming that child, and we as an association are saying that that is intolerable, and we are now going to be working with schools to shift the dialogue away from transformation and diversity to duty of care.
Well, isn't that an issue of serious reflection when ISASA, the Association of Independent Schools, agrees that the issue of racism in private schools is one that clearly society, I guess, is not making an impact on. We're going to continue this conversation in just a moment, and might I just add that one of my favorite columnists, Eusebius Makaiza, writes today in the Sunday World, and he writes under the topic, "Why do hardly any white people get involved and join anti-racism protests?" Might that be an issue? We'll delve deep into this conversation in just a moment. You're watching Politics Unscripted. You're watching Politics Unscripted, and we are in the segment of the show where we discuss a particular topic and we delve deep into that particular matter. And this week we are dealing with the issue of racism in private schools. In conversation, I have with me a panel of experts, and included among them is Dr. Sizwe Nxasana. He is the founder of Future Nations. Dr. Nxasana, I want to come to you first. And can I ask of you, what measures do you have in place to try and make sure that the scourge of racism in the private schooling environment does not persist?
Well, the first thing, let's just talk about, Future Nation schools. It's important to have policies, for starters, that deal with the issue of inclusivity, that make sure that at all levels, whether it is management or it is, the composition of our staff, or it is what we teach and how we deliver the curriculum in our schools, inclusivity is part of it and diversity is part of it. And it is, for instance, in our schools, one of our values. And we talk about diversity in its broader sense, but racism particularly is a particular important issue because it is a scourge in our society. At a broader level, we play a very constructive role across the education space to drive diversity, to drive inclusivity, to transform. For instance, we work very closely with government in a number of areas when it comes to curriculum development, and so on, through especially the National Education Collaboration Trust, of which I am chairman. So we play a very important role, but we have to accept that there's still a long way to go to deal with the issue of racism in particular.
Perhaps in a In one sentence, Dr. Ngasana, are you able to give us the policies that you mentioned, ones that specifically deal with the issue of racism? Might be to do with hair, for example, which is an issue that stems back to 2016, one of the most prominent in our times when we saw protests at the Pretoria Girls' High. What are those specific policies, or what do they talk to?
Well, when we talk about diversity in our context, as an example, let us start, since you've mentioned the issue of hair. We do not teach hair. So, obviously we have the majority African students in our schools, and hair is not an issue. As long as, hair is not colored in, sort of different colors and so on, it's not an issue at all. And, our students can come to school with whatever hairstyle they please. As I said, it's not even an issue. But I think it's important to talk about racism, particularly as it pertains to staff. How do we make sure that there's inclusivity in our staff? There are very clear policies that are in line with employment equity, because it is legislation, actually, to make sure that when it comes to employment practices, we don't have racism. When it comes to our students, again, because it's our policy as well as one of our key values to promote diversity in our environment. And we do have a diverse student body, and therefore it is important, because in our case, for instance, it may be quite possible, because, for instance, we have a few white students in our schools that, because they may be in the minority, that they are discriminated. It's important that whilst they don't get special treatment, they get treated like every other child, but that they feel accommodated, they feel like they belong to our school because they are respected, they're included, they participate in all our activities. And in fact, we celebrate diversity. For instance, when it comes to whether it's holidays or it's whatever kind of, including religious celebrations or traditional celebrations, we have, for instance, Asian children, we have, Chinese children, we have white children, and therefore it's important for all of them to feel that they belong in our environment.
Yeah. Terry Oakley-Smith, let me come to you, CEO of Diversity. The most prominent protest around the issue of hair was in 2016. Why have we not seen any fundamental change, as evidenced by what we saw this week at Cornwall Hill College?
I think that hair is certainly an issue for black pupils, for black female pupils particularly. But I think I want to say that what Sizwe said at the beginning, we're dealing with a whole issue of racism, and the issue of what people wear and how they look is obviously an important matter. But what I see in so many of the schools is that there's no policy. I'm really impressed to hear about your policy, Sizwe. Many schools don't have an anti-discrimination policy. So when racism occurs, they don't have anything to really deal with it in an efficient way. They hear allegations, they hear rumors, but they don't know what it is. And I mean, you referred earlier to Eusebius's article. White people, we don't experience racism. And so we are often totally blind to it. Fortunately, we only make up 8% of the population now. So eventually, I guess, hopefully, all schools will be like Sizwe's school. There'll be majority black pupils and teachers. I think an important issue, and I don't know how the private schools have gotten away with it for so long, but they don't seem to be complying with employment equity at all. They seem to be predominantly white teachers, and there's an assumption, especially among the parents, and possibly because of internalized oppression from some black parents, there's this feeling that white people are more competent. And that it clearly isn't the case. So I think when we address racism in schools, we have to look at it very broadly. And starting off, is there a policy on it? Do we have a staff that reflects the population of South Africa? Or do we have a staff that reflects how South Africa used to be. And possibly the school would like it to continue in that way. I mean, the issue of competence and its being attached to whiteness, I think, is extremely problematic. My son went to a private school, and there were many white teachers there who were extremely mediocre. So, I mean, I think mediocrity, can fly across the board. But I think it starts with, let's look at who's teaching in the schools. Let's look at the culture and the climate of our schools. And then from that position, let's see what interventions we can bring to re-educate teachers. I find white teachers on the whole in the schools that I've worked with are really fearful of transformation. And many of them don't understand it at all and see it as something to be avoided at all costs, instead of seeing it as something that will unite and bring South Africans together and get the best performances from all of us, whether we're black or white.
Yeah.
And I say that as a white person and a minority, a tiny minority in South Africa.
Asanda Ngwasheng, very interesting comments indeed from Terry Oakley-Smith. I want to ask of you, we have seen in some instances white parents defending the schools. But for me, I think what stands out are comments from black parents who at times will say, well, I think the demographics of this school, they're becoming worryingly too black. And therefore, this is not why I brought my school, or I brought my child, rather, to this school. Surely, there's a problem there as well among black people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can't come out of 300 plus years of colonialism that told us that white people were better, were more educated, were smarter, and then come out of 40 plus years of apartheid and come out unscathed. So, of course, black people have internalized the message of racism, much like everybody else. And I think that's why before we even get to the kind of attitudes that parents have towards black teachers in former white schools, let's talk about basic things like how we make fun of people who maybe get some English words wrong. We make fun of people's accents. If somebody has a colored accent or a closer accent when they're speaking English, we make fun of them because we've internalized racism. And so it starts with little things like that, and then it expands to thinking that because your child is being taught by a white person that they're getting a better education, and because your child is being taught in a white school, they're getting a better education. But there's a history for that. That didn't just happen for a reason. The history is that in South Africa, our black schools were underfunded, our white schools were overfunded, and so there was a time wherein being in a white institution meant that you were getting a better level of education. It meant that you were getting most probably a teacher who's more qualified than the child at your black school. Because during apartheid, a black teacher only needed to have a junior certificate, which is the equivalent of grade 10 now, whereas the white teachers needed to have either a matric or a university degree. And so there was a level at which white teachers then were more educated, there was more funding, and there were more resources that were put towards white school. But that is not the case anymore, because we know for a fact that now schools require all teachers, whether they're black or they're white, to have higher qualifications that make them the teacher. But what we have done as a society is that we have continued to allow this belief that Terry very beautifully spoke to, that white equals superior, that white equals intelligent, that white equals better. And our own government has participated in this by not monitoring black economic empowerment at the schools, because beyond the classroom, the people in the tuck shop who run these tuck shops are white. Beyond the classroom, the people who do ballet classes, who do modern dancing classes, who do all of these classes are white. And so the service providers that the school procures, particularly outside of the usual curriculum, themselves are white. And so this reinforces in children, including black children, that white people are better at doing at these things. That's why we're not seeing any black people. And our government, again, in failing to enforce affirmative action, has allowed the situation where both, not just in private schools, but in public schools as well, where they've basically renegated their duties. They take our tax monies and they give them to these schools to be run basically by SGBs, which are still mainly white and who continue to hire white people for SGB posts. And these are the things that we need to start looking at, because if a child looks around and the ground staff are black, they look around and the teaching assistants are black and their actual teachers are white, and they look around and everybody in authority, particularly in management at our schools, is white, then of course there's going to continue to be the belief that whiteness is better and that whiteness is smarter and that whiteness has all of the answers. Meanwhile, we know from having read You Silence, We Amplify, we know from having read every other media article that's come out in the past sort of 10 years about racism in schools, that white teachers in particular are harming young black children. They are harming their identities, they are harming their feelings and thoughts on hair, their feelings and thoughts on their brown skin, and even their culture in particular. And it comes down to white teachers in this country, just like white people in this country, do not have any kind of cultural competence. So they don't understand what it means to be Zulu, what it means to be Xhosa, and what it means to be any other identity that is not white and that is not Christian. And this is the problem that we need to start dealing with.
Mr. Munchane, please tell me the statement that was made by Terry Oakley-Smith is true. She says there is no policy on anti-discrimination in most of these private schools. In fact, she was saying that as a compliment to Mr. Ngasane about his schools having policies around discrimination. Is this true?
I think that much has changed. I think that we're moving very, very quickly. What has happened is that there is a code of conduct. Many schools have codes of conduct. However, more importantly, no teacher can teach in this country without being registered with the South African College for Educators, SACE. SACE has a code of conduct, but I just opened it briefly, and it really sets out very clearly that all teachers have a duty of care for their children and not to harm them physically or psychologically. And any teacher who violates that code can go through a disciplinary hearing, and if they're found guilty on the basis of that disciplinary hearing and are dismissed, the teacher must be informed, SACE must be informed about that decision, and that teacher must be put on the SACE register as somebody who's unqualified. And we're pleased that the Department of Education has also more recently come out with guidelines for the re-education, the re-employment of teachers who have been found to be in breach of various provisions of the Educator Act. I've forgotten the full name of that act. But however, it is very, very clear that all teachers have a duty of care, and SACE does take these things seriously. And actually, when they do disciplinary hearings, they register those teachers and they do hold them accountable. So I think it is important that we talk about that, and that that code of conduct do exist, and that SACE is the overriding legislation for any teacher in this country, be it a public or an independent school teacher.
You talk about a code of conduct.
That a code of conduct is not the same thing, Lebogang, as a policy. An anti-discrimination policy spells out this is what racism is. These are the kind of behaviors that reflect racism. These are the kind of things we will not tolerate in our school. A code of conduct is a different matter. And my concern is that very few schools have an anti-discrimination policy, an anti-racism policy, which is very much more, I mean, I'm glad to hear that schools have codes of conduct, but that doesn't help them if they have to deal with issues of race. I mean, if one looks at this Cornwall College, I mean, if they have to, for example, discipline teachers, they can't go by the code of conduct. They need a policy which states very clearly, this is, saying this, treating a child like this, it goes way beyond care, frankly, I think.
All right. Do you want to respond directly to that question? Because it is the question I asked.
Can I add before Lebogang comes in? Because
sure.
I also have experience of being in schools.
Very briefly, yes, you can.
So I wanna agree with Terry that a lot of the schools that I'm also working in, one of the first things that we do is we work on policies because they don't have policies. And the reason why I called out in particular ISASA for their beautiful diversity charter is because I know the charter, I've seen the charter. It's really amazing, except at the schools where ISASA, where the schools are members of ISASA, not enough of them are actually even implementing the charter themselves. And there aren't enough policies that are very clear. And so what often happens is that everybody's running around like headless chickens, literally, when there is a race event and a race crisis, because there's no policy to guide. There's no clear step 1, this is what you do. Step 2, this is what you do. Step 3, this is what you do. And this is really destabilizing, not just for the teachers who are sitting not knowing what's going to happen for them, for the children who don't know what the sanction is going to be, for the parents who don't know what this means for their children. And I think really, let's be honest with each other and say that there's a code of conduct. Yes, there's a charter, but nobody's implementing it. I think the question is more, why aren't people implementing it rather than that it's there?
All right. Lebogang, very briefly before we go to a short breather.
Yes, and I think that Asanda is actually correct. The difficulty is that we're a voluntary association. But certainly I know that from my association, what we are now looking at is that if you are in breach, your conditions of membership are actually going to be looked at, and maybe you cannot continue to become a member based on whether you are actually implementing the things that, as Asanda says, we go out there and we say the right things and do the right things. And, the other difficulty for me is that what I'm concerned about is about policies and etc. Having integrated a school during apartheid, I am unconvinced that when an adult does something and they're causing harm, they know what they're doing. And we should not have to tell people, you cannot say a racist thing. We should not be saying to people, you should not be denigrating the official languages of our country. We should not have to be saying to people, oh, black hair is an issue. I mean, but you live in Africa. So here's my deep frustrations about policies. I think that really that's why I say it is important for us to talk about a duty of care. And that is a broad system that makes it very clear and says the SAYS code is clear, guys. It really is. We need to use, and I think in South Africa what we love are policies rather than implementation. And as I started at the beginning of this debate, we are now, as ISASA, talking about duty of care and implementation. We're done about policies. Let's implement the laws, because there are plenty of laws that people can use to actually deal and get rid of those teachers who are breaching the rights of children.
I wonder if that is going to satisfy Terry Oakley-Smith and Asanda Ngwasheng. When we return, I'm going to ask Mr. Ngasane whether part of his motivation was what the pictures we just ran for you were just now. Parents, white parents at Cornwall Hill College with placards, some of them reading, "Unhappy? Build your own schools." We'll continue with this conversation in just a moment. You're watching the Uncensored Debate, and with my panelists, we are discussing the issue of racism in private schools. Dr. Ngasane, you decided that you were going to build a string of private schools. Was part of the motivation that you wanted to build schools where any race can come to your school and feel that they are at home? And I ask you this on the back of the placards that were carried by some of the parents, white parents, at Cornwall Hill, with the statement reading, "Unhappy? Build your own school." How does that sit with you?
Before I answer that question, Cody, I just want to go back to the issue, especially the comments by Lebogang Montjane around this duty of care. I think we've got to call racism what it is. I don't think it helps to hide behind the duty of care, because that's a very broad topic. Children at schools must be kept safe, they must be protected, they must be educated, and so on. All of that is duty of care. And therefore, if you not call racism for what it is, you're going to hide under this duty of care. And actually, people are going to continue doing what they've been doing and being racist, for years and years to come. And the second issue is this. If you don't have a clear policy around racism, essentially going back to the point that both Asanda and Terry were saying, as a school, you can never really discipline anyone who flouts what actually doesn't exist. Because if you say you're going to discipline someone under the duty of care, and that person can argue that their act maybe was not racist, whereas in fact it was, you don't have any lever. You don't have any basis. That's why, I mean, to the point that Asanda was making, people run around like headless chicken because there's no clear policy that talks about racism, that talks about, what happens in the cases where there's race. Just like, sexual exploitation and harassment at school and bullying is an issue, and there are policies around those things, so that whether it's a teacher or it's a student, committing an act, which is against the policy of the school, there's a disciplinary process that then follows. So if you don't have that policy, you're just playing games. You're hiding behind words, and I don't think that's really the way we should be going. But to answer your question, it is important, and when you talk about black economic transformation in the country, it's at different levels. We can't run away from transforming schools that are not transformed by simply building our schools as black people. So that's the first thing. You don't run away from the problem. You've got to fix the problem in those institutions, including schools, private schools and public schools. And I actually agree with Asanda. There are a lot of public schools, government schools, that are racist, that they continue to be racist, and some of them even run to courts to protect their racism, status. So you've got to fight the problem at those institutions that are racist. Yes, of course, from an economic participation standpoint, it is important for us as black people to meaningfully participate and not just have minority stakes in white-owned companies, including private schools, but to own our own schools. And of course, we can have, white people as, shareholders in our schools, as long as we control them. In our own case, we are 100% black-owned, and we're very proud about that, but we are quite inclusive in terms of how we look at our teachers, how we look at our students, and the policies that we implement in our schools.
Yeah. Earlier, I referenced the article that's written by Eusebius Makaiza on Sunday World Today. And I want to come to you, Lebogang, because this issue where Mr. Ngasana has just tackled you on as well about duty of care, he says that it's such a broad term that it will get lost in translation. Basically, what is going to hold people accountable is our policies, anti-racism policies. And I want to go to this article under the heading by Eusebius Makaiza, where he says, why do hardly any white people get involved and join in anti-racism protests? And I want to just sum it up, because what his argument is that why do white students, teachers and parents not participate in these anti-racism protests? Because fundamentally what it is a human rights issue. How, Lebogang, would you expect a white teacher who probably subscribes to the thinking of some of the parents who are carrying these placards that go build your own schools if you're not happy, how would you expect that kind of teacher to be aware that they're being racist when they are towards a black child?
I'm glad that Butsiso has taken me on this, is that why I'm now talking about the language and support about duty of care is this. I have seen schools now investigate teachers for discrimination. They bring in racism, and they bring in lawyers to investigate because they failed in their duty of care. And I'm thinking that is important for us to talk about that specifically. And I think that also the other issues that I must also be clear is that when you look at the city's code, it gives you enough for you to take on teachers who do and engage in racist conduct. In terms of the notion that these are our schools, there is no school in this country that is not a South African school. So I think that is important for people to understand that ab initio. Independent schools can only exist because they're given the right in terms of the South African Constitution. And in that Constitution, Section 29(3), it is very clear. You cannot, open an independent school that discriminates on the basis of race.
But you have
So
white
if
parents. You have white
school
parents saying, go build your own.
Pardon?
But you have white parents saying, go build your own. Isn't that a
No,
demonstration
they
of what
cannot
they
build
want?
their own because it's against the. If there's no independent school in this country that can exist without being registered with the state. And when they register themselves, they cannot discriminate on the basis of race. And if the assumption is that black people must build their own schools, if they want to build white-only schools, they need to go and find a white supremacist country where there's only white schools. Our constitution is clear; it doesn't mess around.
All right.
And it actually foresaw the possibility of people opening up schools for whites only.
Okay. All right.
Why can't you then call a spade, Lebogang? Why can't you say that ISASA is encouraging all schools that are part of this body to have a very clear policy? We're talking about racism here. Racism, which is such a serious blight in South Africa. Racism, which I guess all of us are trying to fight. And I must tell you that many white people do not know, and they should by now, all these years afterwards, they don't know very often when they are being racist and get very offended and ticked off if they're, I mean, to be called a racist as a white person is like the worst thing that can happen to you. You can come up with all kinds of excuses and reasons, but we haven't educated ourselves.
All right.
So many white teachers, white children, the parents, the school governing bodies don't understand what racism is. They don't know when they're being racist.
All right. Terry,
and that's part of the problem.
Terry Oakley-Smith, I'm afraid that was the last comment that we're going to have on this particular debate. I know, Asanda Ngwasheng, you probably would have had a full go as well. Dr. Ngasane, must thank you as well for your participation. Lebogang Munjane, thanks indeed for your participation as well. Well, this has been one of those important topics that we just have to get into for society to change for the better. That's where we're going to leave it. Coming up in the next hour, the country's leading journalists and editors share their insights into the stories that make headlines in the country.